JJ Jansen is back for another year in Carolina, but will Eddy Pineiro and Johnny Hekker also be, or is it time to get younger both at kicker and punter? We'll talk about it right here on Locked On Panthers.
You are Locked On Panthers, your daily Carolina Panthers podcast. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Welcome into another edition of the Locked On Panthers podcast, a part of the Locked On Podcast Network. I'm your host, as always, Julian Council, talking Carolina Panthers with you every Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday, and yes, of course, Friday, your team every day. That's our motto here on the Locked On Podcast Network. Thanks for watching the show here on YouTube and listening wherever you listen to your favorite podcast. Be sure to follow me, Julian Council, over on Twitter at Julian Council, where on Fridays throughout the season, I'm right here on the show answering your weekly Friday mailbag questions. All you got to do is either at me or DM me over on Twitter at Julian Council. And welcome again to another episode where we are going to break down the Panthers special teams on today's show. Talk about the defense over the last week and a half. Talk about the offense prior to that. And tomorrow, going to go over the state of the Panthers defense. Going to wait to do it tomorrow because, you know, you go fantasy, you get a defense, you also get the team special teams. So let's talk about special teams today. As Panthers have a couple of things to figure out this offseason as far as their kicker and their punter go. Long snapper, that has been decided. We got the news on Friday that JJ Jansen will be back for his 17th season in Carolina. JJ Jansen forever. We'll talk about him a little bit later on the show. But first, let's start off by talking about the kicker and talking about Eddy Pineiro. Remember, Eddy Pineiro a year ago, after free agency played out, did not get an extension from Carolina. He decided he was going to skip out on OTAs, which are voluntary, but still, it's very rare that a kicker decides that they're not going to take part in the voluntary portion of the offseason, especially when you have such a dramatic change that you had with the dynamic kickoff rule that played out this past season. To not have him out there, that was curious. Now, that allowed Harrison Mevis, who was a rookie out of Missouri, an opportunity to potentially take that job. That, of course, did not happen. And once Eddy did show up for mandatory minicamp and then, of course, training camp, he was out here talking about how he had been one of the most accurate kickers in the NFL's history, and especially since he had entered the league, and how he was kind of feeling like, you know what? I'm somebody who probably should be getting paid top of the market one day. But he wouldn't really necessarily say that completely out loud, but we all knew what the message he was trying to get across. You know, I've been one of the most accurate kickers in the history of the league, and I've helped this team win games. He's also helped this team lose games. I would like to eventually be paid like one of the top kickers in the NFL. Now, looking back at the 2024 season for Eddy Pineiro, he was 22 of 26 on his field goals. That was 84.6%. He was 33 of 35 with his extra points. That was 94.3%. And go back to after the game-winning kick there in Munich. And that's something he's done a couple of times in recent years. Had the game winner against the Giants in Munich. Go back to 2023. Both of the wins of the Panthers in that 2-15 season was a walk-off win by an Eddy Pineiro field goal against Houston. Another walk-off win as well in that win against Atlanta. Go back to the season prior to that against New Orleans, close out the season. He's had a lot of high moments, especially considering the low he had a couple of years ago where PJ Walker made a spectacular throw to DJ Moore, who had literally never been in that situation, took off his helmet, penalty, whether it should have been or not, doesn't really matter. Pineiro misses that field goal, misses another one extra in overtime, and I was saying you should make him drive back on I-85 northbound to Charlotte and not let him fly back with the team. Not to cut him, but he needs to understand just the hellacious traffic and really atone for the sins of that day down in the Peach State playing against the Falcons on that Sunday. But since then, he's been a very reliable kicker, and even to a point where for a portion of this past season in 2024, he was actually the most accurate kicker in the history of the NFL. But looking at it right now on Tuesday, February 18th of 2025, he is the third most accurate kicker in the history of the NFL at 88.095% kicks made, behind Justin Tucker, top all time, and Harrison Butker, who is second all time. And yes, I know, Harrison Butker was a Carolina Panther and probably should be a Carolina Panther. We're not going to do that. But I understand the consternation around that whole situation. And if you look at what the top 5 kickers in the NFL currently are paid, this will give you kind of an idea of what Eddy Pineiro potentially could be asking for, at least looking for, and maybe get from Carolina or another team upcoming here in free agency next month in March. So the top 5 paid kickers based off of average annual value of their contracts. Number 1 is our old friend, Graham Gano, $3.77 million. Number 2 is, again, our old friend, Harrison Butker, $3.75 million. The two top paid players at the kicker position in the National Football League based off of average annual value. Both, once upon a time, were Carolina Panthers. And, well, if we want to go back to it, Graham Gano beat out Harrison Butker and was a good kicker in Carolina. Had a knee issue. Matt Rule wasn't willing to be patient with that. Training staff got that all messed up as well. And we know that guy had issues, as in the feds coming to his house. So Ryan Vermillion, way to go, buddy. But Graham Gano went on, had success with the Gettleman up there in New York, and he's still a good kicker. And he paid back Matt Rule in Carolina back during that 2022 season. You remember when they started off 0-2. So he was good. Harrison Butker also, he's been great as well. Kaimi Fairbairn down there in Houston, $3.68 million. Nick Folk, 3.5. Justin Tucker, 3.5. So a contract based off of the way Eddy Pineiro likely views himself and has been talking about himself as the third most accurate kicker in the history of the NFL would be right there at a $3.75 million range per year. Now, looking at the 2 most recent contracts signed by top kickers in the NFL, Harrison Butker, back on August 7th of last year, signed a 4-year contract extension worth $25.6 million with $17.75 million in fully guaranteed with $3.8 million in new guarantees. So that's the 3.75 per year. And then Kaimi Fairbairn also signed a contract last March in 2024. That was a 3-year deal worth $15.9 million of $11.06 million fully guaranteed to stay down there in Houston. And you got to look at the cap when you're looking at all of this, the percentage necessarily that these guys are going to take up with their contracts. As we talked to Mike Kay of the Charlotte Observer about a month ago about whether the Panthers would sign Eddy Pineiro to an extension. And I felt like it's a no-brainer. You look at the situation in Carolina prior to Eddy Pineiro, you were trotting out Joey Slye throughout the 2020 season, just attempting comically long field goals. And he had the leg on some of them, but a lot of them, obviously, as we saw, they were missed. In Kansas City, missed it. In New Orleans, missed it. Now, Teddy can't take a sack in that situation on that 3rd and long. Understand all of that. Offensive line's got to protect too, yada, yada, yada. But he missed a lot of field goals, and he wasn't the greatest kicker in Carolina. You go back to 2019 when Gano was injured, and he was missing kicks in New Orleans and cost Panthers some games. So we know firsthand that kickers can cost you games. And they were going out there, and they tried out Ryan Santoso. Remember the mustache and the weird picture he had there? I'm sure you've seen it on social media. That worked out for a week. Then they brought in the dude from Kosovo, Larim, like Haralahu or whatever. He was here for a couple weeks. And Zane Gonzalez, he calmed things down, but then got hurt. And then Eddy came in, and Eddie's been kind of a steadying force, especially since blowing that game in Atlanta back in 2022. So things have been good at the kicker spot. So why would you want to potentially put yourself in a position to not have a solid, accurate kicker? And that's where I'm sitting right now. And I said that to Mike, but he talked about how guys like Jake Elliott in Philadelphia were having struggles. Well, Jake Elliott got to the playoffs, and did he miss a kick? Would it matter? No, he did not. So looking at Fairbairn and Butker, their contracts, they're going to cost the cap in Houston and in Kansas City 1.7, 2.3, and 2.1% for Fairbairn over the next couple of years. Butker, 1.9, 2.5, 2.3% of the cap. That's just to better understand when you're looking at these kind of things. Like you look at the Carolina Panthers cap situation right now, Taylor Moton right now, when looking at it, he counts for 11.5% of the cap. Are you that concerned if your kicker counts for 1.9? And then better yet, when you look at teams like, let's go to Houston. Well, Houston's not a great example. Let's go to Kansas City, where they're paying Patrick Mahomes, a king's ransom to be their quarterback. He's got a $66 million cap hit next year. That is 24%. So eventually you're going to have a quarterback who's going to be taking up a significant amount of the cap. That's almost a fourth of the cap. The cap Patrick Mahomes coming up here in 2025 before they do anything with his contract. And Pineiro this past year was 1%. What's another percent if he's going to cost that much to re-sign him to have one of the most accurate kickers in the history of the NFL? Now, here's the only issue that you could really have when it comes to Eddy Pineiro. How often did we see the Panthers having Pineiro try to attempt long field goals this past season? When I talk about long field goals of 50-plus yards, how often was he doing that? Not very often. You actually look back at Eddy Pineiro this past season on those 50-plus yarders, he only ended up attempting two. And it's not the first time in his career he's done that. His rookie season in 2019 in Chicago attempted 2. With the Jets, those 5 games attempted 1. With the Panthers in 2022, attempted 2. Last year in 23, attempted 7, which was a career high, of course, and more than all of them combined in the years prior, then attempted 2 this year. So Carolina's not really asking him, and he was 1 for 2, by the way, to go out there and to kick long field goals. If you look at the other kickers who are top 5 paid in the NFL, Graham Gano is 45-66 in his career. Now, he's played, of course, a lot longer than Eddy Pineiro with a long of 63, and we all remember that win against the Giants. He bailed out Ron Rivera's ass that day after he did not handle the clock well, and that's something that Ron had issue with. But Graham Gano, what a win that season. Harrison Butker, 30 of 45 so far, a long of 62. Kaimi Fairbairn, 42 of 56, a long of 61. Nick Folk, 47 of 70, a long of 56. Justin Tucker, 64 of 96, a long of 66, an NFL record, a long of 66. Pineiro, 11 of 14, which is good, a long of 56. These other guys that are getting paid big money are being asked to attempt 55, 56, 57 plus yarders. The Panthers are not asking Eddy Pineiro to do that. His long this past season was 53. And that limits what you potentially can be able to do offensively. And also, like, you want to see, I mean, teams are way more aggressive now going for 4th downs. But if you're sitting there, it's 4th and 5, and you're at the 40, like, yeah, you want to go for it more times than not. But if you say, let's say it's 4th and 7, rather, and you're at the 40, you would like to try to attempt a 58-yarder and feel like you have a kicker who can do that. Right now, they have no choice but to go for that 4th and 7 or that 4th and 8 win in that situation. And it may work out better for Carolina. But right now, that is not the case. Now, one thing that interesting happened last week was that they signed Matthew Wright to a reserve/future contract. He's 28, so a little bit younger than Eddy, or right around that same age. We'll see. Eddy he's 29. Going to be 30 in September. So basically the same age kicker. And Wright has been here in Carolina before. He was here during training camp in 2023 and returned at the end of last season. They kick in the regular season finale when Eddy was out with injury. And he's made rounds across the league to the Steelers, the 49ers, the Chiefs, Titans. And this is something that I also want to point out when we talk about the 50-plus yarders that are not really attempted that often by Eddy Pineiro. Looking at Matthew Wright, he's appeared in 29 games and has hit 55 of 63 field goals. That's 87.3%, including 7 of 11 from beyond 50. Pineiro, again, 70 career games, has only attempted 14 50-plus yarders. So clearly the teams that Matthew Wright has played for are thinking this guy is capable of kicking 50-plus and having a big leg, where Eddy necessarily does not. Now, from talking to Mike, when we had him on, Carolina apparently is not trying to spend a lot of money on a kicker. I think that they have a good one. Clearly, he's been reliable. He's had plenty to do for the wins that they've had recently, and there's been really one loss you can point back and say, like, Eddy, he cost us that day, and maybe there's a game this past year that also complicated things with a miss he had, but still, Eddy Pineiro's been good. And maybe there's kickers out there. I don't know, but you look at it, he's been accurate. The cap percentage wouldn't really be that much, like 2%. Really, we're that concerned about a 2% cap increase or just percentage for your kicker who's been reliable. But the whole not being able to kick 55-plus yarders, that certainly is something to look at and monitor as Carolina Panthers decide what they want to do when it comes to Eddy Pineiro and their kicker spot here in free agency in a month's time in March. But JJ Jansen, he's back. Will Johnny Hekker also be back, or will the Panthers move on from him? We'll talk about that here in just a moment on Locked On Panthers. When the game tips off, the NBA action is just getting started, and there's no better place to get in on it than FanDuel, America's #1 sportsbook. With FanDuel, you can place live bets throughout the game, so even if you miss the opening tip-off or want to bet on a fourth-quarter comeback, you can stay in the action, and if you're looking for a bigger payout, you can even combine your live bets to a same-game parlay, and we're getting so close to March Madness being back and FanDuel being right the place you want to go. Right now, new FanDuel customers get $150 in bonus bets if your first $5 bet wins. Just visit FanDuel.com to join today. That's FanDuel.com for your shot at $150 in bonus bets. Make every moment more. FanDuel, the official sports betting partner of the NBA. Great news came out on Friday as Carolina Panthers announced that they had signed their long snapper JJ Jansen to yet another one-year deal, bringing him back for his 17th season here in Carolina. Jansen has been a Panther since 2009, has played in more games than any player in the 30-season history of the Carolina Panthers franchise. He broke the Panthers record held by his former mentor, John Casey, who, if you can spell Casey's last name correctly, you can complain about that game in Super Bowl 38 that he kicked the ball out of bounds. If you can't spell it correctly, don't want to hear from you. He broke that record back in December of 2022. His mark of 260 games played is also 41st all-time in league history. He could get to 27th all-time if he plays every game this year to get to 277. And why not 280 or 81 if necessary for Carolina this upcoming season? That means going to the Super Bowl, of course. So we'd love to see that. But JJ Jansen, he's back. So that's one more situation that's figured out as far as special teams goes this upcoming season. And Matt Rule tried to replace him. Drafted a long snapper in the 6th round and Thomas Sander out of Alabama. That did not work out. And I'll just never forget that video. That dude just like, wait, you're actually, well, hold on, you're drafting me right now? Why? And didn't work. Got hurt. They stayed on IR. They brought him back the next year and could not beat out JJ Jansen. So how dare you, Matt Rule, try to replace JJ Jansen, the longest tenured Carolina Panther? Get out of here. Well, he's already long gone, chilling in Nebraska, not having spring games because they can't pay their players there. Broke-ass Huskers. All right, Johnny Hekker. He is potentially going to be back, but we'll see. He's a free agent upcoming here in a month's time, and the Panthers got to figure out what they want to do. Looking at Johnny and his stats this past year compared to the rest of the league, he averaged 45.7 yards per punt. That's 29th in the NFL, so not that great. League average was 47.6. He had a 41.5 net yards per punt attempt. That was tied for 14th in the NFL. That was above league average, which was 41.4. So by 0.1 yard, he was above league average. Looking at his touchback percentage, that was 4.1. The 9th best in the NFL. League average was 7.6. So good to see that. And then his inside the 20 percentage was a 32.9. That was the 4th worst in the NFL among punters. The league average was 41.6. So significantly below that. He's now 35 and hasn't been a Pro Bowler or an All-Pro since 2017 when he was clearly the best punter. He was a part of the All-Decade team. So he's been a really good punter in the NFL. And he was okay this past year, and you're just not going to get the same Johnny Hekker that you saw in LA. And the Panthers have never gotten that. And you look at the contract he last got paid on, it was paying him, looking at average annual value, $1.623 million per year. That's second in the NFL. I don't think he's kicking at the level of being the second highest paid punter in the National Football League based off of average annual value of that deal. And you look at a couple of guys that could be available. Actually, I mean, I think they're going to be available as far as veteran free agent punters. And these are dudes who are under the age of 30. J.K. Scott, formerly of Alabama, he is with the Los Angeles Chargers. He had a 46.7 yards per punt attempt, so that's a full yard better than Johnny Hekker this past year. Had a 41.9 net yards. That's 0.4 above Johnny. Had 5.6 touchback percentage. That's a little bit worse than what Johnny did, than the 38.9 inside of 20 percentage. Compare that to 32.9 with Johnny. So J.K. Scott would make some sense. They want to go after him. Jamie Gillen was up there in New York with the Giants, had a 43.3 yards per attempt. That was lower than Johnny. 38.7 net yards, also lower. 3.7 touchback percentage, which was actually better. It was it was better. And then 33.3 was pretty close to the inside 20%. Inside the 20 percentage. So that's not necessarily the best option I would look at. But Johnny Hekker, I wouldn't mind it. Doesn't seem like he's really been somebody that's like hurt this team, done fairly well as far as field position, not having a ton of touchbacks, but also not having a ton of kicks inside the 20. But also that comes down as the offense moving the ball. Does he have a lot of opportunities to try to kick the ball inside the 20? And maybe not as much so as some of the other kickers in the league over the last couple of years. So I could be down with that. I could also be down with J.K. Scott. And maybe we'll talk about this a little bit later on the show. Maybe the Panthers go after an option via the draft, or at least, undrafted player that they want to sign. So we'll talk about that and take a look at some of these special teams free agents outside of this core of the battery of Johnny Hekker, no longer JJ Jansen and Eddy Pineiro. When we come back here in just a moment on Locked On Panthers. All right, back here on Locked On Panthers, taking a look at special teams in Carolina as the Panthers are approaching free agency next month. And next week, by the way, is the NFL Scouting Combine up in Indianapolis once again. So we will hear from Dan Morgan. We'll hear from Dave Canales as well. And I'm going to spend plenty of time talking about that. We'll take a look at some draft prospects, probably have draft analysts on, try to get somebody also in the local market on to get some guests on to break things up as we get closer to free agency. And, we're kind of in that middle part of the offseason where it's like not really anything going on. So that's why I've been doing this offseason preview, looking at every position group to try to give y'all some good content until we actually get to where things are happening. Because right now in February, pretty dead, period. At least this week. Next week, there will things be going on for sure as far as the rest of the league goes with the Scouting Combine up there in Indianapolis. So it's looking at a couple of the free agents that the Panthers have that are free agents that are special teams focused guys. Felipe Franks was really good for Carolina this past year. Also a tight end. I would think you'd want to bring him back. David Moore, he's been able to play special teams as a returner. I would think he's going to be back not only as like a returner, but also to be a wide receiver for Carolina, again, to be a part of that offense. Mike Boone is somebody this staff really liked a lot, and I think he probably gets another opportunity. Cam Gill, don't think so, as he was injured a decent amount. And we talked about this yesterday, the three safeties that would be coming back in a role as special teams aces. That's Nick Scott. That's Sam Franklin Jr. That's Lonnie Johnson Jr. as well. Sam Franklin would be the number one for me. And then Lonnie, because this staff really liked him. And Nick could make sense because he knows, obviously, the scheme. And he's probably who you'd want out there. Maybe Lonnie instead, but certainly Jero Vero trust him out there for whatever reason at safety if there was going to be any sort of injury, and that's going to be a room that's likely rebuilt. We'll see if Xavier Woods gets re-signed. I don't imagine Jordan Fuller will be back in a starting role, possibly, I suppose, but I would think that those three, if they're coming back, that's Nick Scott, that's Sam Franklin Jr., that's Lonnie Johnson Jr., they're all coming back in a role to be special teamers once again. And it's really a reduced role for Nick Scott, where that's what Franklin and Johnson were brought in to do last year. Anyways, now those are all unrestricted free agents. Some restricted free agents Carolina has are guys like Devin Tompkins, who came in as kind of a gadget guy and a potential special teamer. He's somebody that dates back to the time that Dave Canales spent, which was only 1 year in Tampa. I would not be surprised if they try to bring him back. I don't know if they want to do a restricted tag for or restricted tender for him. That may be a little bit much. But Raheem Blackshear, that's another one I think is really interesting. He was the primary returner for Carolina this past year. Looking at his numbers, they weren't that great. He averaged 25.5 yards per kickoff return, which was 20th in the NFL. League average was 27.6. He also had an 8.5 yards per punt return, which was 21st in the NFL. League average was 9.9. So you look at it, okay, 2.1 yards, 1.4 yards, like that's not that big of a deal. Well, it is pretty significant when you actually look at some of the other guys out there, and like it's below league average. Like, do you want a below league average returner? And like punt returns, I don't get really all that caught up in nowadays. It's just catch the ball, don't drop it. Kickoff return, that is important now, considering the dynamic kickoff rule that they changed. And it was temporary. I'm guessing whenever the rules committee meets again, it's going to be permanent moving forward because the NFL got exactly what they wanted, far more returns, and to bring that play back to make it safer. There's nothing safe about playing a game of football, but I understand what they're at least trying to accomplish. And supposedly they did that. I'm sure plenty of guys got hurt on that play still, but maybe not at the same rate in the past. Got to look at the numbers. Don't have them in front of me. But whatever. That's what they're going to do. I'm cool with it. It's still weird to like watch a college game and then tune over and to watch the NFL game, and then you have a completely different kickoff. So, I mean, but you look, they're two different games anyway. So, Blackshear, I would guess he's probably gone. Velus Jones Jr. wouldn't think that he's somebody that they're going to bring back on a restricted tender. And then Dan Jacinta as well. That might be somebody. He played 80% of the special team snaps in the games that he played. He would be somebody I think they would want to bring back in kind of that role, be kind of a Brandon Zylstra type of guy that the staff likes. So I don't know if they want to give him the tender, but certainly if he's available after that as an unrestricted free agent, they would want to bring him back and probably want to bring back all those guys. I think the only guy when looking at restricted free agents coming up that they would want to tender is Cade Mays. That would make the most sense. The rest of them, I don't think it's all that pressing to do so. We're talking about options outside of veteran options at both kicker and at punter in the draft. I'm not endorsing Carolina drafts kicker. If they want to do it, okay, by all means, sure. But the guys, when looking at PFF's big board that are the top kickers in this draft class upcoming are Ryan Fitzgerald out of Florida State. And Florida State was terrible this past year. But this guy was kind of their offense whenever they got in range. And by getting in range, it was like, just get to the 40 and they're in range. And you saw that opening weekend, week 0 in Dublin. He nailed some long 50-plus yard kicks, much bigger leg it looks like than Eddy Pineiro. And I'm sure a Florida State guy would love to come in and take a Florida guy's job. But Ryan Fitzgerald was pretty good. He had some struggles early in his career, but really became a reliable kicker. Caden Davis, solid at Ole Miss. Ben Sauls from Pitt and Pitt. They've had some good kickers. Chris Blewett, he's a kicker that was at Pitt back in the day. Andres Borregales was a dude who was the top kicker in his class coming out of high school. Has been down at Miami. He's been really solid. That's somebody that I really like, and he would make some sense as well for Carolina if they want to go a draft option or maybe be able to sign somebody as an undrafted free agent, which I think is probably preferred. But if you're going to take somebody in the 7th round, the guy you had in the 7th round this past year was not going to make the team, Michael Barrett. Now, they traded him to Seattle to get Mike Jackson, and everything worked out perfectly. I would just think that if you're going to use a 7th-round pick, it makes more sense to use it on a kicker or a specialist like that instead of some dude who's literally not going to make the team because he is like a linebacker who's undersized. That's just typically how it's worked out, at least here in Carolina. And then Kai Kroger, looking at punters, he is awesome. I don't know how many of y'all pay attention to South Carolina football. I'm sure plenty of you, considering, they're into Carolinas, of course, and they're just polluting our city as well with all the Buffalo Bills fans, but even South Carolina, whatever. I live with one of them, so that's on me too. But Kai Kroger is a really good punter, and I would think that you'd probably want to go younger, as in like rookie at punter, opposed to wanting to go with a veteran punter who's like just under 30. It'll be 30 like after one season, which is what J.K. Scott and Gilliam that we talked about earlier would be. Jamie Gillen out of the Giants. So Kai Kroger, South Carolina, that's the guy I'd be looking at if I'm Carolina. And right down the road, why not go have them team back up with all the Gamecocks already on the team? You got JC, you got Clowney, you got Wonham. You got Leggett. There's just so many Gamecocks on the team. Why not add another, since they clearly love those boys down there in Columbia? That's going to wrap up this edition of the Locked On Panthers podcast, a part of the Locked On Podcast Network, hosted by yours truly, Julian Council. Again, y'all subscribe or follow the show for free on YouTube or wherever you listen to your favorite podcast. And be sure to follow me, Julian Council, over on Twitter at Julian Council, where on Friday we'll be back answering your weekly Friday mailbag questions. All you got to do is either at me or DM me to get those questions into me right now. In the meantime, be safe, be happy, be whole. As always, keep pounding it. On tomorrow's show, going to take a look at the state of the Carolina Panthers defense heading into free agency here on Locked On Panthers.